Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Tan Liu from City University of Hong Kong. I'm very happy and very honored today to be here to moderate this panel, and very happy to have been able to invite some of our leading figures of the field and excellent researchers with different practices to come here and to share their experiences and wisdom along the way of their research. Before I introduce the topic, I would like to pull our audience a little bit. So who does research in the lab studies? Okay, quite some. And who does field studies? Oh, also quite some. And who have been to talks on both types of research so far at CHI? Oh, wow, that's pretty good. So we have a very open-minded community, and everyone appreciates different research. That's great. So that's also something we want to talk about today. And as we know, CHI is a very diverse field with different research paradigms and schools of practices. So today we will talk about our different kind of beliefs and practices, so to create some, let's say, shared understanding and maybe reduce some of the biases that we have about the research that we are not so familiar with. So, as we know, CHI embraces a wide range of research methods and topics. For example, as classic HCI, we run controlled experiments in the lab, such as the first one, Fitts law pointing experiment, or an experiment to evaluate interaction techniques on large displays or in the VR or AR environment. On the other hand, we also have research in the wild, where we conduct interviews, participatory design, workshops, or deploy technology interventions in the public space or in communities and to study things in context. So lab studies are more the kind of research we control the factors to identify causal relationships and where we maximize precision. And field studies, on the other hand, maximizes the understanding of technology use in context. This is the common consensus. For classic HCI method, we have been receiving quite some critiques in the field, such as Nielsen once mentioned that quantitative user research may be overly focused on statistic analysis, which could lead to misleading or overly narrow results. And Greenberg and Buxton also mentioned if we overly stress scientific contribution in HCI research, it could harm design and engineering innovation. And also, we have heard from Carl and Rosen about how HCI should be producing actionable and effective knowledge rather than merely accurate descriptions, analyses, and theories. On the other hand, some of the qualitative research that we do in the wild gets often criticized by the lack of replication, let's say, or some design research also questioned for its scientific contribution in the field. When it comes to the impact of research, some of us might say, like, oh, my research, I'm very proud of my research because it builds up solid scientific knowledge to help us understand the future of technology. And while some others might say, oh, my research is saving people's lives and building communities and directly addressing social and societal concerns. So, as the HCI community, how do we deal with this different value system that are coexisting among us when we need to actually set bars to judge and review each other's work? So today, let's talk about this paradigm divide, and in terms of the trade-offs between different research methods and the impact different type of research could possibly make, and the skills and resources that might be required to conduct different type of research. So next, we will have each of our panelists come present their position and share some of their stories in their research career, and as the first part, and then we will have a curated session with our panelists here. Having an interactive discussion before we open it up to the floor and accept audience questions. So first, let's welcome Shumin Zhai from Google for his short presentation. And I'm just going to switch the slides, if you can come over. So Shumin is a principal scientist at Google, the former editor-in-chief of Tokai, and a member of Kai Academy and ACM fellow. And his research had long-lasting impact via products such as Android platform. So without ado, I will let Shumin introduce his experience, and let's welcome.
Thank you. So I do research mostly at the relatively low-level user performance and psychology and behavior, and their application to slightly higher-level user interface design and development, invention, and vice versa. We try to derive more generalizable theoretical models from the practice that we do, and sometimes they raise new questions and so on and so forth. So when Tan asked us to think about what are the fundamental dilemmas or divisions in the HCI community, frankly, we all think, well, there's no such a thing because it really depends on what you do. But on the other hand, it's really also evident that there's tension everywhere. And the ultimate tension is that what our field is really about. Is it about our community or is it about our impact? Is it about the method or is it about the result? All these are constantly on our mind, and we implicitly actually debate about them all the time among ourselves. So I'm trying to use this short few minutes to illustrate how I personally have, in a way, answered or tried to identify these trade-offs, if you will, in my own research I've been involved in. So first of all, in the end, actually everybody agree impact is ultimately what matters. So, but what makes impact? What research will generate impact? I'm trying to put them into a simple equation, that is, impact generally comes to as a function of show and tell. The show is about doing things, about demo or die, about making artifacts, making products, making systems that would carry the message. And in fact, many early theories in HCI argues artifacts is the embodiment of our theory, of our knowledge. On the other hand, you cannot just do it without understanding. You have to be able to tell, as a community, what the understanding is. And so there you have these trade-offs in terms of, is the understanding generalizable? How is that abstracted from context? Or is it possible to have both preserving the context and still generalize knowledge without further abstraction? So there's all these tensions around. And there's a question about rigor and precision. And the general idea of providing precision and generalization is using some sort of models. But then you can argue all models at some level is wrong. But some are useful, depending on where you use it. So now I'm just pick one example of the type of research I've been involved in, namely the invention, development of swipe typing. In terms of impact, today, swipe typing is arguably one of the noted inventions from this field that actually is deployed, or at least available on all smartphones, on Android or on iOS, from different manufacturers or providers like Google, like Microsoft, like Swiftkey, like Swipe, and many other products, almost all leading keyboards, with one or two exceptions that doesn't offer. They do all to offer this option. So how did we generate such artifact in the end? What are the theories or models or methods that lead to it? So before the invention or the basic idea of gesture typing or swipe typing emerged, my colleagues and I have been involved in a long period of study of basic human motor control behavior, namely Fitch's law, namely laws for crossing, namely laws for the steering or path, and so on and so forth. So there was some groundwork. Each of these, you can see an element of it in gesture typing. For example, you can conceptualize gesture typing as passing through sets of tunnels. But each of them is also insufficient. And arguably, it's not even necessary for the final invention. So there's a lot of details that is kind of a trade-off, but it's also a complex relationship. And also a lot of it is about community building, about literature building. So I would say all of these low-level understandings were for us was useful, but may not be certainly not sufficient. Recently, we've been doing more modeling work in terms of taking some basic theories of human motor control, namely minimum jerk, to combine that with statistics, so you can generate gestures that would enable you to do large scale modeling work, simulation work, that would enable us to predict behavior that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do in a lab. So therefore, it's another type of methods that I feel our field is not using enough. But on the other hand, it also faces its own challenges. In terms of lab versus wild, big part of the breakthrough is we did essentially an early product when iOS just come online. And that had generated many downloads that initially laid the foundation. We actually had a paper called Shapewriter in the Wild on iPhone. That was actually more of a contribution in some sense than each element of it. That proved this paradigm can be actually established and adopted by the user in a large scale. But the question is that how much of the laboratory studies was actually a proof of the method until it's deployed? You can say we actually did some experiments, but none of them completely answer the question. And even today, there's no single study would prove every aspect of it. For example, about 3 or 4 years ago, we published a paper, Perola Christensen and his student and myself published a paper studying how people use keyboard in the lab and how people use it in the wild and measuring the performance. And there's clear discrepancies between the two settings. In the end, I would say there are different methods for contributing to different parts of a research project, as well as there's also this artifacts aspect of it, that you have to involve a lot of technologies and a lot of know-how. In our case, going back to information theory, going back to basic language modeling, and all these techniques to bring them together. So there's not a single method that would enable a sufficient deployment of a product that has impact. That would be my basic proposition.
So thanks, Shumin. Next, we have Wendy Makai. She is a research director leading the XC2 group at INRIA-Saclay in Paris. And she is a member of the Kai Academy. Her research employs both quantitative and qualitative methods and covers topics on interaction paradigms and research methods. Welcome.
Thank you. All right. I started out as an experimental psychologist, which meant that our model of the world was a scientific one. The idea is that whenever we talk about our research, we start with theory. We're looking for cause-effect relationships. We do empirical work in the form of controlled experiments. We have specific measures, highly rigorous, and we test our theory through empirical observation and generate new theory and test theory and so on. And so that cycle back and forth is very typical of a large number of the natural sciences. However, I stopped being a psychologist for a while. I'm a lapsed psychologist. I went off into industry for a while, built some products, and then went back and did a different kind of PhD and worked with social scientists. And in that world, you start at the bottom with observation, and you develop theory through observation. And you go back and forth between deep qualitative work, understanding what actual people do in the world. And I would like to say that there are a large number of sciences in the natural sciences that do exactly this. Astronomers do not necessarily start with theory. They have to look at stars first. And archaeologists have to look at the word things in the field, and geologists and so on. So there are a large number of sciences that all have this characteristic of going back and forth between theory and empirical observation. But, okay, so that's great. You can do both in HCI. But HCI is actually harder than this because we have this other phenomenon in the middle. So there's not some independent object or phenomenon that we're studying, but rather it's the design of objects that we are creating ourselves and studying for ourselves. And so within the HCI community, we have a large number of possible paths that we can take through this. And so I can start, as Shumin does here. He's got theoretical models that he can test. He can run controlled studies. He builds prototypes and he tests them. And he can test them in the wild or he can test them outside. Anyway, I can go on for hours about this. I won't because I only have a little bit of time. But the point is that we can do research in a multidisciplinary field that is legitimate, rigorous research that has elements of qualitative and quantitative measures and questions. We can do evaluative research. We can do generative research. There's a wide range of possibilities. I think the key is, as researchers in HCI, we need to be aware of the kinds of questions that we're asking, the kinds of results that we're looking for, and the value systems in which those methods are embedded. So now what I'm going to do is come up with two rather ancient studies. The first one is actually the very first thing I did in HCI when I moved from being a psychologist to actually working in industry. And at the time, there was this big influx of people looking at artificial intelligence. And so we were working with the very first system that did interactive video on a computer, turned into a product, whole other story. And we wanted to do intelligent tutoring systems. But before you do that, you have to figure out, well, is it actually useful to have intelligence in the tutor that you give? All right, so now as a good experimental psychologist, I was really paying attention to all the different ways I can control a learning experiment. So the first thing you do is you create a new text editor from scratch. I programmed a lot in those days. I could do that. My students are there looking at me like, really? You? Okay, I did. And what we do is we divide the command set into three different pieces. One group of commands, these are all equivalent. You have no tutoring. So that's your baseline. That's your control. And then you have an intelligent tutor and a random tutor. But how do you control that? How do you make sure that everybody gets exactly the same number of tutoring interventions? Well, you use what's called a yoked control. So what it would mean is if I have Shumin and San here, what I do is I'm the wizard. It's a Wizard of Oz experiment. I'm in another room, and I give Shumin and San an extremely boring task, and I make them do it over 4 days for an hour each day. They're really sick of it. And I give them no information about how the editor works except the arrow keys, how to insert, and how to delete. Everything else is on them. Okay, so now they have an incentive to learn. For the first half hour of every session, for the section that is intelligent tutor, it's all counterbalanced beautifully and so on. I watch what Shumin is doing, and since I know the task, I can see what he's doing from the other room on a screen. I give him exactly the tip that he needs just as he's about to need it. But San gets it too. So from his perspective, it's an incredibly intelligent system that gives him exactly what he needs. And from her, it's an annoying interruption. And then halfway through, I switch to the other command set. I watch her. I give her contingent, relevant advice. And Shumin now gets it, the random version. So what do we get? Now, the long story short is on the quantitative. Oh, it doesn't show the whole slide. Okay. Quantitative results are the following. If you do the pre-test, random behavior, then you do the post-test. At the post-test, the non-tutoring, they didn't do very well. They were terrible. But no difference in terms of performance between the relevant intelligent and the completely random non-intelligent tutor. So if I'm in a business, I say, who needs AI? I'm just going to do this random interrupting my users, and that'll be fine. And then you get the paperclip from Microsoft. But in fact, if you do the qualitative side of that, you actually ask users what they thought. They start telling you things like, I absolutely hated it when the computer was hating me, or I hated it when they were in that, random condition, and they loved it when it was in this contingent condition. So all that they learned in spite of themselves, the qualitative and the quantitative data are radically different. And if you don't ask both kinds of questions, you lose a major part of the story. Now I'm going to shift. This was published in a tiny short form in 2001. Same time, I just realized these are all done at the same time. So we have the notion of technology probes, and yet another study we did with the elderly. This is exactly the opposite kind of thing. This is starting with a longitudinal study with 6 families, half of them from France, half of them in Sweden, over 87 people, who are working with us doing a series of participatory design activities over time, and we're trying to get a vision of the future that we're living in now, actually, although it's not quite the same, to kind of think about how you would want to communicate within your family in the future. And so there we have this idea of building probes where we let them envision a future world that they wouldn't otherwise have. We embed that. We let them go home with it. They live with it for a month or 6 weeks or whatever. And they have a whole different way of thinking about what it is. Now, technology probes are set up so that we are explicitly looking for theoretical kinds of findings, empirical findings, and design inspirations. And so in this model of generative research, we're going in and trying to create new ways of understanding the world and coming up with new ways of thinking about human-computer interactions, right? And I just want to say the very last piece before I stop is that we worked with families, and we did a lot of things with video. Video is a theme that keeps coming back. And letting people share. And close families love sharing images of each other and so on. Then we shifted to seniors and the elderly. And all of a sudden, that is an absolutely horrible technology for them. First of all, if you're 87, you do not want to look at a lot of pictures of yourself, and you don't want to share a lot of pictures of yourself. So we completely changed it, and we created a series of lightweight motion detectors that you can interact with in a lightweight way. In this particular clock on the side, there's my own activity, which is, say, the red one. And the more I move, the darker this trace. And then if I'm not moving at all, it's very light and disappears. So I can move myself. I can see what the action reaction is in the clock. And then I can also see somebody at a distance who's living in a different place, maybe a family, maybe my grandkids, maybe another person. And so we had this whole other way of generating new kinds of ideas that all spring out of the same set of empirical studies, but turned into different kinds of technologies. And the qualitative elements of that are critically important. So all I want to say is, in a sense, I think this is an audience that if you're here, you already understand and appreciate this. But as a community, we need to be able to think about how to effectively ask questions that have both cause and effect relationships, qualitative generative design ideas, new ways of thinking about theory, new understanding of how human beings interact with technology. All of that is legitimate in the scope of what we are as human-computer interaction. And I think that's really exciting. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Wendy. Next, let's welcome Enrico Costanza. He is an associate professor at the UCL Interaction Center. His research intersects design and technology influenced by behavior and social science.
Oops. Thank you, San, for inviting me and for organizing this. So I am the person in the middle of 5 panelists, so I'm going to reinforce even more the idea that we need to take an approach that is dependent on the problem that we are addressing. So having to follow from 2 big people names like Wendy and Shumin, I thought instead of going into theoretical ideas, I would just show some of my work and how in a series of projects I started from the field and then moved to the lab, which in my head is a bit sort of the opposite. And I think one of Shumin's examples were actually start from the lab and then move to the field. So I've been interested in AI, which is something that is up and down popular within HCI. And in particular, how AI and autonomous systems could be integrated or could get in the way of people's everyday life in a domestic context. In particular, I've been interested in the idea of AI systems applied to renewable energy. So can we have something at home, like a smart thermostat, that help us make the most of renewables? So because energy is something that is very integral to our life, and it's something that is very related to comfort, it's been really critical to study this kind of systems and prototypes in the field, in actual people homes. So a challenge has been, how do we expose people in their homes to a scenario that may not yet be implemented? Lots of countries are building the smart grid, but the smart grid is not there yet. So to try and address that, we, together with many colleagues, some of which are in the room right now, we designed an experimental trick. We basically used financial incentives together with sensor data. So we measure people's real, actual energy consumption in their homes, and then we use this data to influence a fictional bill that they pay at the end of the study. So if they play nicely with our system, if they use more renewables, they get lower bills, so they get more money at the end of the study. We used this methodology in 4 field studies around 3 prototypes, something like a smart thermostat, smart washing machine, and a sort of a smart energy meter. First and foremost, we were pleased to see that the experimental trick seems to work. Participants were very immersed in the fictional scenario. These studies were kind of exploratory. We found that people engage with the prototypes even more than we expected. And we started to notice things that then motivated us to move to the lab. For example, one thing that I really was intrigued by is that even though we told participants that the prototype that they were playing with only looked at one day before to predict what's going to come after, in the interviews we had comments like, oh yeah, at the beginning it was not working very well, but after a few weeks it learned my routines. And I was like, no, it didn't. It doesn't do that. So we started to wonder, what is it that makes people overestimate how well an AI system works? To try and address that, we designed a control study, which we ran both on the lab and on MTurk, where we exposed participants to a fictional story. We told them that we are evaluating 2 handwriting recognition algorithms. In reality, they were all fake and they were at the same performance. However, in one condition, as you see on the slide, there was an animation that shows you something that looks like the last 2 lines of the text are being processed in front of your eyes. While in the other condition, you just see sort of a static version. And I was surprised to see that the animation leads people to think that the system works better. And they go into the detail of explaining why they think, like it makes less mistakes of this type or that type. Other things that I decided to try and study in the lab were details of the interface design. Yesterday, Jacob Kitley-Davis, my PhD student, presented a paper about how can we best design feedback for computer vision algorithms. They are common now in a lot of apps. Amazon, for example, allows you to just take your phone, scan a product, and see how much it costs on Amazon. But what if it doesn't work? We wanted to compare different ways to give feedback to participants. A challenge here, as I hint in the title of the slide, was that we needed to design a study where we could make things fail in a controlled way. Feedback is most useful when the algorithm doesn't work. However, how do we make it fail in a way that is not obvious? If I ask people just scan a white wall, obviously it's not going to work. So the solution was to develop an iPad application to do stop-motion animations, and then essentially trick our users to use this app against a set of backgrounds, some of which we know in advance make the app fail. However, we managed to keep the experiment to be playful and engaging, so participants were motivated to just interact with the system. And the final example I want to show is about another sort of interface design detail. So some AI algorithms can produce confidence information. So, for example, the Nest thermostat could tell you something like, I'm 70% confident that you're not at home right now, so I'm going to switch the heating off. We wondered, is this 70% meaningful to users who don't have a technical background, or is it just noise? What if it's 90 or 95%? However, instead of studying this with the thermostat, we designed a study where we had a graphical user interface. Again, we played with this idea of like a simple handwriting recognition algorithm. And then we borrowed methods from behavioral economics to have a study design where participants could choose essentially whether to use the handwriting the sort of smart system or not. One group of participants got the confidence information, and one group of participants got the version without confidence information. And we were able to observe that, yes, confidence led people to use the system more than the other group. That's all I have time for now, but I hope we will have a chance to discuss later.
Thank you, Enrico. Next, let's welcome Hamid Alavi. He is a lecturer in the University of Freiburg from Switzerland. He is experienced in conducting living life research. Also, his research projects, some of them reached the market and created an impact outside of academia. Okay.
Thank you, Son. Thanks for organizing. It's already exciting. So what I am going to do in the 5 minutes that I have is that I'm going to basically take one example, and then through telling you about that example, I want to give just one very simple message. So the example that I'm bringing to this conversation is from the area of designing educational technologies, in particular technologies that can scaffold learning and teaching in classrooms. And having tried to actually engage seriously in bringing one designed research technology, the main outcome of my own PhD, to be adopted in many schools and classrooms, I think I've learned lessons in that process that are relevant to the discussion that we want to have here, discussion of impactful research methods in HCI. The work that I'm actually telling you about is done around the years of 2012 to 2015, the framework of the startup that I led on the basis of my PhD, and so that's sort of my past life that doesn't stop coming back to me, apparently. I don't know why. So let me begin in a slightly technical way. A person who is interested in designing and studying classroom technologies is constantly faced with a rather critical challenge, namely the challenge of tuning and adjusting the the requirements for the adoption of the technology that he or she is designing, with a very narrow space of possibilities for change in a highly organized and well-established pedagogical practices that we have in schools. So in reality, teachers have a lot of practical constraints while they have to deliver an overwhelming deal of expectations. Then you have students, parents, schools, regulations that are imposed on schools, and all together they create sort of a very complex context that has to be understood, and that understanding should be embodied by the design of the technology to be impactful, to be adoptable. So that is reasonable, and it is reasonable to believe that central to research in educational technology is to create that intricate, comprehensive, qualitative understanding of the context. But what I want to say here is that quite paradoxically, and I'll tell you why I think it's paradoxical, quantitative results are quite crucial in the process of adoption. But before that, let me just give you a little bit of background, like what I'm really talking about in terms of technology and context. So the learning situation that I studied during my PhD goes with different names: tutoring sessions, exercise sessions. So this is what happens usually after the lecture session. So you have students forming small groups, and they work on a set of exercises, and then you have tutors moving around, and then they give help. The idea is to basically there to promote collaborative problem solving. And the technology that I proposed, and I actually did a lot of research on, there the idea, to put it loosely, is to make visible information that would have been otherwise invisible in an ambient way, in sort of in the space of the classroom, to be able to sort of facilitate the interaction between students and tutors and among the students themselves, again, to encourage collaboration. But the details of the technology and studies, I'm not sure if I remember them all. But what I want to tell you is that I employed different types of research methods, leading to qualitative and quantitative results. Qualitative results, so after my PhD, when I started actually the spin-off work, I understood that when I'm talking to teachers, qualitative results are really, really useful because they can relate with it, they actually understand what I'm talking about in terms of context. But from the decision makers, I received a lot of how much questions. And this is not how much your solution costs, because that you can actually work out in your production process. This is rather the question of how much our school can save, or how much our school can operate more efficiently if we adopt your technology. And therefore, those questions, a non-numeric answer is a non-answer. So you see that already this is one instance that quantitative results can actually help, practically can help in the process of adoption. The other instance is that quantitative results make better news headlines. So that was sort of the message that I just wanted to convey, that both methods are, of course, important. And in the process of actually having an impactful research, after doing the research, I just wanted to show you that interplay. And I assume that in other domains and in other sort of similar experiences, something of the same sort must be true.
Thank you, Hamid. Our last panelist coming for a presentation is Professor Wendy Moncur. She is working in University of Dundee, and she leads the interdisciplinary Living Digital Group, which researches living human experience in the digital age. She uses mixed method and integrates stakeholder views and priorities deeply into the research.
Hi there. When we spoke before this panel, so we got together to talk about how we did research, which kind of made me think about how I do research, because of course we do our day job and sometimes we don't kind of take that high level step back. So I thought I'd first cover just how I do it. And I think for me, one of the important things is the ethos of my research. So everything really is guided by a personal ethos, which I'll touch on in a minute. And of course you've got to come up with the cool ideas. That might be hanging out with friends or walking or talking with colleagues or reading a paper and realising there's a gap. But you've got to have an idea. You also usually need to collaborate. So I don't code either, Wendy. Maybe it's a thing, Wendy's don't code these days. I used to as well. But we need to collaborate. So I collaborate with a lot of different people. I collaborate with lawyers, psychologists, computer vision people, just whoever I need to actually fill the slot for a skill once I've had an idea. And then I'll work with people to build up kind of the real bones of the idea into something actionable. We refine it. Of course, we need money. I'm not sure if that's an in the wild skill or an in the lab skill, but it's a core skill. Do some research, have some impact. For me, increasingly, I'm very keen on involving stakeholders throughout that whole process. Probably not the ideation, probably not the ethos, that's kind of my thing. But once I get to the collaboration, I really want, part of my ethos is that I want to deliver outcomes that have relevance in the world. I come from industry, so I spent 18 years in industry in lots of different industries. I never knew what you guys did. When women told me they were a research fellow, I was bewildered. So I come very much from a background where in industry, the kind of industries I worked in, we looked rather curiously at academics as people that weren't terribly useful but were very clever. I've now moved on from that, so I was very excited to get a PhD. But now what I'd like to do is make sure that the research I do as an academic is useful. I also, as part of my work, I think it's really important to deliver personal agency. So I'm very interested in personal data, and I want people to have agency over their data. I don't want to make decisions for them. I want to enable them. I focus very much on a diversity of human experience and particularly about living in a digital age. So variously, my work has looked at life transitions and increasingly online identity, trust, privacy. You could badge it as cybersecurity, but I would still put it under personal agency myself. It's got to be exciting. I don't want to get out of bed unless it's exciting. So I do mixed methods research. And for me, we talk about triangulation. For me, it's always the first step is qualitative inquiry. So I don't want to say, hey, do you like blue or yellow? I want to know what colours you like, if I ask it. Not that that's my research. But I'm interested in the nuance of people and the diversity of them. So I would do, for me, qualitative inquiry first. But I would then want to back it up with some numbers and make sure that we got the right findings from a little study by doing a large-scale study. But going back to this commitment to stakeholders, for me that triangulation is by putting that data to the stakeholders that I have, which are usually either government or NGOs, and seeing how they respond, not just to get a response from them as giving an opinion, I'm using them as participants as well. This is an example of the kind of work that I do. This was done with Abby Durrant and colleagues on a project called Charting the Digital Lifespan. We produced a picture book, so 2 years of research, using those steps of qual and quant research. We distilled into 3 cartoon strips. And we got stakeholders in a room, so we got stakeholders from government, from law enforcement, from industry, from the media. And we gave them these 3 little cartoon strips with narratives grounded in our qualitative insights and our quant insights. We also summarised research insights from across the areas we looked at, and we then got them to respond to these little cartoon strips, no white paper, we didn't want to bore them, but what we did was we kind of wrung out more information from them so that they were our participants, but they were also our impact. I think that's it. So that's my stand.
Thank you, Wendy. So next we are going to have a conversation session. Let's welcome all our panelists go to the stage, and I have a list of questions that we can start with. Yeah. So the order. So we have heard some of the stories of our panelists, and they apparently have gone through different paths, and they have, although they all believe that we need to use different methods, and we need all, but they have gone through different things, and they have different positions and from their experience. So let's start with asking all of them a question. Say, what is good HCI research for you? In a way, like, what kind of knowledge should we be producing in the HCI community? And I wonder, how you feel about that. So maybe let's start with Shumin.
I guess two things. One is impact I've emphasized. One is impact I've emphasized before. But it's also about kind of a personal passion and also somewhat the relevance to this community. And there it's not a trade-off, but in some sense it's a tension. That is, what a research community is about the community itself, which has its certain values, and or about beyond the community in terms of the impact in the world. And I would say there's value to both. And for example, we all care about writing papers. We all care about whether the papers get cited. And in some sense, these are all internal or intrinsic impact or relevance. The ultimate impact is in the world. So I would say there are values to both, and we should pursue both and recognize that it may not be completely the same.
All right. Okay. So there's lots of good kinds of HCI research, and I would not presume to tell people that yours is good and yours is not so good or whatever. Well, I guess I would if I'm in a program committee and I make some decisions, but anyway. But I think as researchers we do have an interesting challenge, and my challenge to you and to myself is, can we as researchers change the way we think about things? Can you shift perspectives? Can you give us a different model? Can we challenge the status quo? Can we think about the world in a somewhat different way, which then opens up new opportunities for doing different things? So as HCI researchers, I think there's this tremendous opportunity to do generative research that shifts perspectives, as I said, and opens up to the world in terms of impact, has an impact on the world through changing the way we think about how things should be.
Yeah, tricky one. What comes to mind is what one of my first mentors said, which was demo and publish, or perish and die. I feel that, in HCI, we need to strike the right balance. I agree with what was already said, that you need something that you're excited about. You need something that you're passionate about, but at the same time, you also need something that will keep you in the job. So I think there is the tricky balancing act to be able to do something that you're passionate and excited about, but at the same time that you can sell, quote unquote, or sell without quote unquote, because funding as you get ahead in your career becomes a critical issue.
I don't know. I still think that what we do is science. And then the practice of doing good HCI is the practice of doing good science. But we have to know, actually, we have to understand what kind of science we're doing, right? So I believe that, I think you mentioned in one of the slides that maybe HCI is actually action science. So we don't want to only produce accurate, precise, and sort of theory-generating knowledge, but knowledge that is actionable, knowledge that is practical, and that is really a challenge, how to do that. In terms of, well, if you're talking about research methods, I think the bottom line is that the research methods should be driven by the study objectives, and that's it. And then the rest of it is just about doing the thing in the right way. And to me, that's it.
So I guess for me, the appeal of HCI is that it's such a broad church and it's very flexible and draws on so many different disciplines. So in terms of what is good HCI research for me, I think one of the things is that it's deeply grounded in existing knowledge. So we're not pretending we're reinventing things if we're not, and we're drawing on so many different fields, and I like that interdisciplinarity. So whether we borrow from psychology or sociology or mechanical engineering, whatever it is, and understanding that HCI does borrow from things and yet it creates something new and exciting, and when it's done well, it makes the world better for people to live in and give them tools that are better suited to them.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess we all agree that we need to publish our research in a way that we're generating new knowledge. But there are so many different criteria of reviewing, is this knowledge worth publishing, right? So then there are many different practices in our field. So there are different type of science in a way, let's say, action science versus more traditional kind of science, hypothesis testing, different ways. So, in our field there are differences. So, what do you think in terms of on the more practical level, in a way, when we are judging each other's work, what do you think would be the acceptable, useful knowledge for you in our research field? And what are the things you think then that wouldn't be so useful? Would you? Maybe Wendy. Wendy, maybe you can start.
Okay. I'm actually thinking of the question that's behind you too, and sort of influenced by that. But I think many of us have been in a situation in which we have written a paper using a methodology that we think is appropriate to the question that we're asking, and then had a reviewer come back and say, no, you shouldn't have done that. You should have done this other thing. It's a little bit like the complaint that you get when a movie critic criticizes the movie they thought you should have, produced rather than the one that was actually done. And so we have a certain element of, I think, having to justify our research methods as well as presenting the results of our work, which is far less common in the natural sciences. If you're within a particular area in biology or in experimental psychology, there's a known set of methods, and you stay within that set of methods, and very, very few people go outside of that, and they make major innovations because they've done that, but they have to battle through. We're constantly reassessing what are appropriate methods for the kinds of questions we ask. And I think that's why we have this, on this panel, we're all hearing, there should be lots of different methods and we should do all these things, and I deeply believe that, but I also think that we have to be able to justify why we're using those and have an audience of reviewers and people who take up the results of these things that can take that into account as well. And so it's complicated.
Yes. That actually also leads to our second question in a way that we know that because of the whole diverse practices in our field, there might be tensions in a way that we might felt in a community, some people understand what I do, some people don't understand what I do, some people may disagree or really with what we do. So what do you think about this? How do we deal with this different value systems within the same publication system or the same community where we want to, presumably build on each other's work rather than tear each other's work apart. So, what do you? Do you have any kind of your experience or any advice in a way that how, in terms of the tensions that you faced or experienced in your career, and what would be your advice on how to deal with that? Maybe who wanna start? Anyone?
I have a recommendation, given the time, is that we also let the audience respond to some of this as well.
Yes, we can also, because we ran out of a bit of time with the presentation, so let's open it to the audience a bit earlier. So if you want to address any of the question that I ask or ask another question, feel free to raise your hand. We have our volunteer too. Yes. So.
Hey, thanks for the great panel. Andy War from Uber. So you've talked about these, like the HCI researcher in terms of having this qualitative and quantitative skill set. Do you think the individual HCI researcher is a jack of all trades and master in none, or some type of unicorn? And Wendy, you've mentioned collaboration already, which I think is a fine answer. What about the individual researcher, though, and the skills that we develop and apply to our practice?
I think it's a really good question, and it's a really good question for career development for junior researchers. So I think once you're at the stage that you're fairly senior in academia, it's really handy to have a lot of different skills and act like a human Babel fish and be able to translate between lots of different fields. So I can kind of get it when I'm talking to a lawyer or somebody who does computer vision or someone that's a psychologist, or I can talk to a journalist, and I'm good at navigating all that. But for somebody coming out of a PhD looking for a job, there ain't no job with that as a job description. So I think it's quite challenging for junior staff. And while I really value in my PhD students the ability to be very flexible, I'm also conscious that I need to produce people that can get a job afterwards. And I think we still, to quite a strong extent, operate within disciplinary constraints. So I need to advertise for a qualitative postdoc or a quant postdoc, because if I get one that can do both, the chances are they don't have strong enough skills in both to deliver totally on the project.
Go ahead.
Actually, I agree strongly with that. And I was going to say that, as there's various students of mine that are sitting in the audience there, I really like to have students get a taste of everything. So if you're a really quantitative person or a really technical person, and make them go out and do some interviews and talk to real human beings. And then if you can but if you do that, then you should be able to build something or at least understand these things. And it's not, but when it all comes down to it, I agree with you. At the end, a PhD student coming out will have a strong focus of set of tools that are sort of research tools that they are good at and they understand and they can go in depth. And then they have the ability to talk to other people so that they can collaborate. And it's not that you can't develop additional skills as you go, because of course you can. But I think when you're just starting out as a researcher, it's a good idea to have a focus and then a range of sort of breadth to be able to talk to people and collaborate.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I normally think of this, and I find it useful to think of this as a T-shaped profile, where like you have some knowledge of a broad range of things, but then there's one specific aspect where you can go farther. So for me, for example, is the technical element. I feel that like because I have technical training, I can build prototypes that can survive in field deployment. And that's the advice I normally give also people who are starting the PhD, because it was interesting to hear from Wendy about the perspective of like when people finish the PhD. But even when you start the PhD, normally the advice that I give is think about where you have a competitive edge, and again, think about surviving in the publication space, and then think about how you can constrain your research questions so that you can make the most of the skills that you already have when you start a PhD.
Yeah, that's actually one of our very important questions in terms of the skills that are needed. And I would also maybe continue that line. Also, we can talk about maybe the resources that are needed for conducting those different research. I think it's not only skills. It's like, for example, Wendy Moncur mentioned that you involve stakeholders in the process. And my experience with stakeholders had been, let's say, bumpy in a way that, because we kind of, when you deal with stakeholders, you need to respect their timeline of working and their administrative procedures and so on. So there is a certain time cost and among with other kind of cost or resources needed when we involve stakeholders in the process. I wonder, actually, based on your experience, what do you think about that?
I think I was initially very shy of asking stakeholders for their time. And then I realized that when people are sitting in an office doing the same job all the time, being asked to do something different and have a day out is quite nice. So I kind of moved from thinking I was begging to asking that if they wanted to hang out and do something interesting, and explaining to them the benefits that they would get. So I'm very careful to explain that, for example, if I'm doing a systematic review of a whole area which will be relevant for them, I promise them I'll give them a summary of it at the end, so they've got up-to-date information for a day of their time. They've got loads back. So I try to make sure there's a quid pro quo. I'm now not shy of asking, which I used to be very shy of asking, but now I'm shameless. And that seems to work. So I have people that are really, really enthusiastic about being involved as stakeholders. I flag up the fabulous people that I work with so that the stakeholders know they're going to get access to lots of brilliant people to talk to. And I also emphasize the network that they'll have access to through the other stakeholders. So we end up all looking forward to coming to an event, and with asking stakeholders to contribute to the research direction, they feel really invested as well. So I think that's taken me a long time to figure out that actually people in industry and government would quite like to be involved in the research and guide it, and that we respect their views.
Hi. Coming from industry, I'm often challenged to characterize the business impact of my research. And I was wondering if you guys could characterize your experience with that as well.
In a way, that's actually not my answer, but my question. Especially Wendy, I'll give my answer later, but Wendy has a really interesting comparison. That is, Wendy, the data management engineer, versus Wendy, the professor. You used to think the academics were smart, but not so useful people. Yes. So does that Wendy think today's Wendy both useful and smart, or what is it? So in a way, it's the same question as from the audience. That is, how academic as a community can be interesting both to themselves as well as to the practitioners. Do they have to be?
Do they have to be what?
Do they have to be useful to practitioners?
I guess this is part of my standpoint on HCI research, is my research should be useful, but also that's kind of looking back at who I was in industry. If I'd had someone come to me from academia and explain why my input was relevant, and take the time to translate the academic research to something that I understood as somebody working in industry, I would have appreciated it. And two, I would have been quite happy to invest time because it was something different to my usual day job. Yeah, so as long as I had that communication and explained what the reason was for the research, I would have engaged.
So here's a little bit of my answer based on my experience, especially at Google. I have a few colleagues in here from Google in this room. We have a bit more, maybe 10 times more, coming to Kai. But there's an army of UX people at Google. And I would say a lot of them, if not the majority, don't think what we do here is of any interest to them at all. Well, maybe not of any interest, but certainly not vital interest to them. But that brings back to the question, is that we are not doing enough, or is it because it is important to have a community that, in a way, build the literature, the literacy, the infrastructure for itself, in a way, as most normal science do. That is, big part of normal science or regular field is more defined by their own internal, intrinsic value system, by some sort of cultural norm. And I think that's also a unique challenge to our field because it's not really one field. So we constantly trying to shift or judge or mix different value system to when it comes to paper reviews or recognizing work. It's an interesting challenge.
So I think we're forgetting the fact that Kai has a strong, despite the fact it's very multidisciplinary and this and that and the other thing, there's a strong core in the papers track of people who are actually professors. And part of the role that we have is to do this two-sided activity. One half is to do research, and the other half is to teach. And the way we get our research out through all those UX people is that we teach them things in classes. And it may not be, so one of the big things that we do is we try to get computer science students to take some HCI courses and to think about different ways of taking advantage of new things that have been happening in the field and change how they think about what it means to design an interactive system. And so I would argue that we have this sort of very difficult to measure but very real impact through our students. And of course, I'm particularly interested in my students that go on in research. I'd love to see, them becoming professors and having their own research groups and so on. But it's also critical that some of them go off into industry and actually build stuff.
Yeah. Add a point. So the way that I usually see impact is in 4 dimensions: impact on people, impact on policies, projects, and practices. And having impact on practice of businesses is not exactly the easiest or the most accessible one, because often when we talk about or we think about businesses, they involve multiple disciplines. And the first thing that we need to do is to actually be more multidisciplinary at the level of academic work, and then be able to actually have real impact on businesses.
Okay, that was a very interesting discussion about impact. Oh, we have another?
Do we have any more questions from the floor?
Or do we have maybe other opinions from the audience about impact? What do you think? How our research making impact? No?
Can I just ask a question of the audience? How many of you are people who were trained as HCI researchers as either the undergraduate or the graduate level? No, I was not. You were not. Were you trained as an HCI researcher? I was trained as a psychologist. In other words, maybe that's my age speaking here, but it's interesting. And how many of you would consider yourselves academics as opposed to being in industry? So academics on one hand, and then people in industry. Okay, so there's a few. All right. So I think it would be interesting to hear from the other people in industry about the impact, although you're special people in industry because you're the ones who come to Kai. There aren't that many of you, as Shumin has said. But okay.
Maybe Sunny can tell us her experience. She's a very successful researcher. She still comes to Kai, publishes to Kai, but she has real responsibilities in terms of Google's privacy and security products and all that. So what's your perspective?
Which question am I answering?
Your experience in terms of you being able to do both. In industry, as a practitioner as well as a researcher.
So I think the question that was asked might not have been what was discussed.
Well,
as someone who has managed people, So as someone who has managed people in UX, what I heard you asking was, how do you show the impact of your research within your company? Was that what you were asking?
Yeah, to an extent, yes.
Which was not, I think, the discussion we were having.
But it's a perfectly good question.
But what impact does research at Kai have on industry?
Yeah, especially in the combination sense. That is both relevance or interest, both to the Kai as a community, as well as to the companies we serve or the users we serve. Yes.
I don't want to answer on behalf of the company here. Well, I think we can come here and get inspired either by methods we see being practiced. I think we can learn about users we might not have accessed yet. We can absolutely do recruiting. I know I talk to academics about holes we're missing or things that we think need to be taught. For example, I think it would be very nice if academics were focused more on teaching UX writing skills, because I think that's an area that we don't have enough of, that we're always trying to hire more of. I think more people need solid UX writing skills, not just technical writing skills, and we don't see enough people who are qualified for that. And I often use this opportunity at conferences like that to try to get that out to the professors.
I think we have a question now. Jan Bosch's.
So to the ways we can have impact, or we do have impact, I had a wonderful little discussion the other day. I'm going to a conference regularly called Sketching in Hardware, which is a very crazy bunch of people, designers, researchers, artists, all kinds of folks interested in sort of electronics and how you make electronics prototyping more like sketching on paper. Anyway, one of the people who was organizing it was actually asked, I used to go to Kai, one of the members said in an email form, is that still a thing these days? And he answered basically, well, kind of, they are still meeting, but it's not really relevant for the world outside. And of course I was listening in on that email thread. I was like, oh, I gotta go in there. And what I ended up doing was, during that year at Sketching, I didn't go there to talk about my latest research. I went there and said, here are 10 things that just happened at Kai, because that meeting is in August, Kai is in the spring. Here are 10 things that just happened at Kai that I think you will find highly interesting for your practical design, engineering, artistic, whatever work. And I explained to them how Kai works these days and what kind of topics are actually going on. So I involuntarily kind of became sort of an ambassador for, they are a lot of academics at Kai, but they are actually still relevant and they're doing cool stuff. And after I sort of showed the sort of like highlight of just 10 things that were really interesting for the group, I think it changed a little bit of the perspective of those practitioners. So even though these folks probably all did PhDs and all, used to be in the academic treadmill, once you enter industry, I think there's a danger that you just tend to forget about it because there's so many other things that are important in your career. And it might be worth reaching out to, industry circles that you are connected to as an academic, or your alumni, for example, and just remind them, hey, this year, by the way, the coolest things that you might find interesting are these little bits of pieces of information from Kai.
Okay, I think we are approaching okay, do we have another question? Okay.
I just wanted to comment that I sometimes feel very afraid to talk to senior researchers. I'm a PhD student at TU Eindhoven, and especially in moments like these when some of the questions seem very relevant for me, especially when you consider things like what is actually valuable to research. I just wonder what is the best way to approach that topic, because I think we tend to get stuck on very specific details, like what is the best method to think about concept X, rather than what kind of work do you think in your career actually made an impact and added value to society. So what would be an easy way for junior researchers to approach you and ask you questions like that?
Just come up and say hi. It'll work. Literally, I'm dead serious. They're very friendly people here.
It's true, because I think that I learn a lot all the time from talking to anyone. The students who want to apply for a PhD, senior professors. I found it really interesting. I just wanted to make a comment about the point that Wendy made. Actually, it's true. When I was writing my PhD thesis, I noticed that a lot of examples from the HCI stars were not HCI PhDs. They were PhDs in another discipline, and instead, when I was writing, it was like a PhD in HCI. And I felt that that's something that perhaps we don't have enough reflection on. And the point that Ian made, I think, goes in the same direction. Like perhaps as a community, we can do more in terms of reflecting on how things change because of how the game changes based on how the community changes.
Right. So that actually is really related to our last question. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So let's say the rest of the panelists, if you can answer, let's give your ultimate advice to the new HCI researchers, the PhD students in entering the field and having all this, a variety of different researches in front of them. What would be your ultimate advice? Just one sentence each. Okay.
I guess that HCI is a very rich space with many paths crossing it from multiple disciplines, and you can choose the path you travel, but make sure that you like the direction you're going in.
I'm just going to so I would say that whatever you do, I think it's the serious commitment to do it right is important, and the judge be yourself.
I think I'm going to repeat the idea of the balancing act. Do something that you're excited about, do something that you're passionate about, but find the right balance between that and something that you can sell to whoever it is that you need to sell, be that your company, be that your PhD advisor, or be that the Kai reviewers, which I'm sure we all have some stereotypes in mind about.
I'm going to borrow my favorite piece of advice from my thesis advisor, who was a psychologist. And his advice was look for surprises. And I think that's how you do that, which is, it's very easy to say, do it right, be passionate, so on and so forth. But what's really going to make a difference is when you see something that other people haven't seen. And what's very easy to do is see something that you think is surprising and then assume it's because, well, I don't really know about this stuff and, everybody else has seen it. Don't assume that. Write it down, take a look at it, and check, because it may well be something surprising and it may well be the seed of something that is really new and interesting. So pursue the surprises.
I would say find your passion, align that with impact, but also always go back to first principles, always go back to common sense, that pull them all together.
All right. Thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists, and thank you all for participation. That was the end of the panel. Thank you.